Sheng Molweni. Welcome to our live stream, which is about education researchers' response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So today, Jet Education Service is launching their Theme 12 report, which is about innovative finance for education during and after COVID-19. So my name is Lesedi Matlala, and I'm from Jet Education Services, and I'm based at the M&E unit. I'm working as an M&E researcher. So to join today in our conversation is Dr. Susan de Witt. So she's our guest, and she's going to talk to us about innovative finance for education during and after COVID-19. So I will introduce our guest, Dr. Susan. So Dr. Susan de Witt is the Innovative Finance Senior Advisor at the Bertha Center for Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the Graduate School of Business in Cape Town. As such, she leads the Secretariat for the GSG-affiliated Impact Investing South Africa, which is responsible for marketing building across the capital spectrum in South Africa. In addition to that, she works closely with all levels of government to implement outcome-based contracts and outcomes funds across sectors, and is a recent fellow at the Oxford University OLAB program. So prior to this, she worked with social investment and finance team in the UK Cabinet Office, engaging with social impact bonds specifically and social investment policy more broadly. She holds an MBA Graduate Schools of Business and BVS from University of Pretoria. Dr. Susan is going to talk to us about the launching of the report entitled Innovative Finance for Education during and after COVID-19. This is a very thought-provoking matter because according to research, innovative finance is one of a growing set of tools and strategies that are being developed to harness private capital to address the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But first, we need to understand and to get some basics from Dr. Susan in our conversation. And these are among the things that we'll unpack. So, ladies and gentlemen, without wasting time, please join me in welcoming our guest, Dr. Susan de Witt. Dr. Susan de Witt, welcome to the live stream.
Thanks, Lesedi. Thank you for that lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. So, Dr. de Witt, without perhaps going straight to our theme or our main theme, can I get a sense of your role in the research bootcamp that was held by Jet Education Services?
So we were actually kind of late to the party. The way that this particular paper came about is I had given James a call expressing a request from Impact Investing South Africa. So you mentioned that in my introduction, that we've been working with market builders around growing the impact investing market. They had requested a sector-specific policy papers around innovative finance, one of them being education. I shared this with James because the Bertha Center had been working with Jet Education Services on 3 different projects. And he said, right, we're running this boot camp. Don't you want to write a paper? And I thought, that's excellent. We can align. And little did I know what I had gotten myself into. But in one phone call, I had become principal researcher on this paper. So that was my role. And then I brought in Tatenda Nyamunda, who was a co-researcher, and built a small team of junior researchers, about 5 of them, and worked over a month to produce this paper. So, yes, it was a serendipitous.
Fantastic. So, Dr. Susan, what is the main objective or purpose of this particular theme, which is about innovative finance?
So I think you expressed it well. It's about the use of innovative finance during the pre and post-COVID or during and post-COVID. We call it the emergency recovery and renewal phase. But as I initially mentioned, this is not just for the sake of research. This paper we are sharing with public and private sector actors so they can use some of the recommendations and frankly existing body of work that is being generated across the market to spur their thinking around pushing more capital into this space. So it's a research project with a very practical application.
Thank you very much, Dr. Susan. I think you gave us a clear explanation of what this is about, especially us who don't have background in finance. And I think we're learning here. So now perhaps I would have to ask this question. What is innovative finance and why do we need it?
That's a good question to start off with. I think a lot of people hear the term and think, "Oh, creative accounting. I wonder what this is." But no, I think let's start off with what the issue is, and I think we would all agree that the funding needs in the education sector during and after the pandemic far surpasses the government's ability to pay for them. And this is coupled with an already strained and arguably inefficient system, which has prioritized access over quality or equity in the last couple of decades. So there are already cracks that are showing in the system. And there is a need to increase both the quantum or the amount of capital, both in the short term and long term, and the effectiveness of how we spend that in the long term. So innovative finance is really a broad, an umbrella term to cover a growing set of tools and strategies that are being developed to harness private capital to address national development goals and globally the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. So governments around the world are supporting private markets to support them. Innovative finance optimizes the financial and social return elements. A lot of your viewers will also have heard of terms like impact investing. So impact investing falls within this family of strategies. Impact investing is a type of investment where you would expect a financial return, but you would also be intentional about generating a social or environmental return, and you would measure that. The other term that comes up quite a lot is blended finance. Again, it's a strategy. It's not an asset class. Basically, it's a strategy where you take different types of capital. So capital, for instance, from the government, which is willing to take quite a high risk, versus capital from, say, pension funds, which is very risk averse, blending it together to be able to then on-lend it to businesses or projects at an affordable rate. So, I mean, we look at innovative financing because ultimately we can use these methods to mobilize additional resources from both traditional, so government and philanthropy, as well as non-traditional investment sources. There are ways in which we can increase the effectiveness, efficiency, and equity of that funding. We can hopefully stimulate innovation in delivery. And, you know, with this paper, we want to keep agenda on education on the agenda. Health and employment is taking a lot of airspace, but I think we all agree that education is one of the key developmental building blocks, and that has to be maintained through this crisis.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Susan. So you also mentioned other models of finance in your discussion or your explanation. So how does this specifically, the innovative finance, differ from any other models of finance?
So by far, the bulk of funding for education comes from the public sector. I think about 350 billion per annum, and about 50 billion from official development assistance, ODA. And there's a smaller amount coming from grant funders. So Trialogue has worked out that approximately 5 out of the 10 billion donated by corporate foundations specifically goes towards education. It is a priority for donors in this country. The way that we would consider, working with that kind of funding is how to use it to, first of all, leverage additional funding. So we talked about blended finance structures. How do we use certain types of government or donor capital to attract other types of capital? How do we design contracts in a way that are, you're highly accountable? So you're partly paying for the results that are achieved, not just for a set of activities. How can you use private sector to catalyze new models of delivery, rather than needing to test them at scale within the public sector itself? How can you draw on the capacity of private sector to do that? So we're taking that funding and we're using part of it in a different way. And then the second sort of model of finance that people are used to are return-seeking finance. So investment finance, your bog standard debt and equity. Except that model is also being turned on its head. I talked about impact investment funding. Currently, only between 1% and 5% of impact investment globally is, according to the Global Impact Investing Network, is being spent on education. And that is mainly going into low-cost private schools, student finance, and ed tech. There is a huge amount of potential within that market to allocate more commercial type funding into this space, and multiple strategies that are being employed across the spectrum to be able to do that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Susan, for that insights. So, since the research bootcamp itself, it was focusing on the education system. So, how do we go about employing the innovative finance models to benefit the education system in South Africa?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question, because really that's the practical application of this paper. But this is not the only pocket of energy that is pushing in that direction. I mean, there are multiple areas of activity and organizations that are building the market, highly reliant on collaboration between public, private, civil society, and academia. And I'm going to call out a few of those collaborative efforts and the champions and visionaries inside and outside of government that are pushing these models forward. So in other words, what I'm saying is that, well, how do we go about employing it? It's already happening. How do we capitalize on what's already happening? Well, I'll talk about that in a second, but maybe a shout out to some of the existing collaborations. NECT is arguably the prototype. So how do we pull in public and private sector grant funding to be able to test different models of delivery? I'm going to call out ISFAP, the student financing scheme that was spearheaded by Sizwe Nkasana and his team, where they are combining public and private sector purse to extend affordable financing or mix of loan and grant to fund students with a view to not only access but also success, so student support. I'm going to call out the work of the Bonds for Jobs team, the Yellowwoods team specifically, who've put together a pay-for-performance instrument that is funding alternative pathways into skilled first-time work for matric graduates, and doing that at scale and speedily. And I also mentioned the three projects that we're working on with JET and DNA Economics, which revolve predominantly around early phase literacy and numeracy, both tackling it from the angle of initial teacher education. So looking at alternative distance learning models that take advantage of placement in public schools, so internship models, and then looking at outcomes-based contracts and larger outcomes funds that support teacher in-school teaching. So essentially continuing education support for teachers in school, relying on grade reading system. And the government has played a significant role in pushing these projects along already, both the Department of Basic Education, Higher Education, National Treasury, GTAC. So they are champions at all levels that understand that this innovation is not only needed, but potentially really desirable in certain areas. And we're figuring out what those areas are.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
let me say one more thing. I've talked about these highly sort of collaborative models, called out a few people. I also want to talk about the potentially the infrastructure, like the institutionalization that might be required for government to take maximum advantage. And a couple of the recommendations in the report describe what I've termed an innovative finance unit, which is an opportunity to either to build either inside government or to build a formalized partnership between organizations that are developing expertise with strong links to government, to be able to collate information, share information, evaluate the benefits of different models, and to even instigate this kind of work from within public sector, rather than having it brought in and from an external point of view. That's the first thing. And the second thing was, I think that there's a place for one of our DFIs, Development Finance Institutes, to build specific market knowledge, sort of technical structuring knowledge around education projects. I'm going to mention specifically the DBSA, who've been working with the CISA to develop a student housing model. I think the DBSA could expand that portfolio to include the infrastructure backlog in the education system and potentially even the ICT rollout. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Susan. And thanks for those important points that you mentioned last as well. So now we have a clarity of how we can go about employing these innovative finance models to benefit the education system in South Africa. And in your explanation, you made it clear how we can go about doing that. So having seen and read the report myself, it has a comprehensive, innovative finance toolbox. Could you please take us on the journey to unpack this toolbox?
Yeah, so I mean, the way that this report has been structured is that we've looked at the short, medium and long-term need. We've looked at the existing pots of capital. And then we've tried to highlight some of the tools that are being used here and across the world, almost to catalog what's being done, and built the recommendations off the back of that catalog. Now, that catalog, the toolbox, is divided into sort of three overarching objectives. The first is to make the case for a coherent policy approach. So I've already talked about the establishment of this innovative finance unit. There is precedent for it elsewhere, and that toolbox gives multiple examples of that precedent. The second overarching objective within that toolbox is to increase investment in public schools. And I've already mentioned the first suggestion that's around building specific technical capacity. The other would be around issuing education-specific bonds. And I'll go through that a little bit more in my recommendation section. The third is around harnessing the skill and capacity of non-state actors. So not simply using non-state actors to randomly fill gaps, but to use them in in close collaboration to address specific problems. And the toolbox in that regard outlines a number of different tools, which include performance-based funding. We've mentioned outcomes funds, performance-based instruments, social impact bonds. We've also mentioned impact investing, so how to bring private sector in to fund specific business models. And then finally, looking at sort of high-value collaborations to test alternative delivery models and how one can combine grant and investment funding to do so. So without sort of, I'm going to encourage people to go to the report actually, because in each of those elements that I've spoken about, we've built out kind of tables of examples which give an idea of what's happening around the world. And there's a lot of detail in there that people will find interesting. For example, the Global Partnership for Education is building a multilateral international finance facility, which is a global development finance institute where they can then lend money to low and middle income countries to leverage 4 times the amount from their donor community. So, I mean, that is an idea that could be achieved potentially scale at a national level. A second example I might just pull out just to pique people's interest. So some of you made of the social bond idea that has been floated by an advisory group led by Miriam Altman and Intellidex, led by Stuart Theobald, about how to raise a large sovereign bond, social bond, that will adhere to certain impact measurement management standards. The purpose of raise, opposed to a kind of vanilla sovereign bond, would be to A, lock in mission, and B, to diversify your set of investors to hopefully lower your cost of capital for that bond. As we know, we've had a downgrade. We're going through a tough time, the government especially. We're borrowing at a high cost. How can we draw people in that are willing to perhaps sacrifice some return if they are guaranteed of impact? And an example of that would be Ecuador, who are the first national country to issue this type of bond. So it is possible, and I think one could pursue that strategy within the education system itself. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Susan. So for those who haven't seen the report yet, I'm sure now they've got a better picture of what to find, particularly about the comprehensive innovative finance box that is just unpacked for us here. So the report is available at the Chairperson's website and Twitter and other social media platforms as well. So people can go and find it there so that they can see the comprehensive financial box that is just unpacked for us. So Dr. Susan, I'm going to ask you a double-barrel questions. So what are the recommendations emanating from this report that are applicable during COVID-19 and those that take us beyond COVID-19 towards a more sustainable funding approach to education?
Great. So, I mean, this is the heart of the report. It's kind of the call to action, and it builds, as I say, on the toolbox. There are ultimately 9 recommendations. The first one I've talked about, it's around institutionalizing some of this knowledge by building an innovative finance unit dedicated to education. The short-term recommendations, because it is difficult to mobilize, especially investment funding in the short term. Other models that can be used to capitalize on private sector contribution to our public schooling system. The first recommendation has to do with centralizing learning through broadcasting and low-tech solutions. So we've seen that the SABC, DSTV, etc., broadcast some of their lessons. But I think that we feel that this can be significantly strengthened to include all grades with larger amounts of content on public broadcasting systems. So the call is for private companies work hand in hand with our national broadcaster to make these streams available to all children across South Africa. So that even though kids are going back to school, they're going to be behind. We may have another lockdown. There may be lockdown in certain areas. And so we feel that the casting should continue to happen over the course of the year. And companies should step up to the plate around this. The second is very much based on the bond idea, but using that to address short-term infrastructure needs. There are a number of COVID-19 bonds that have been issued in the last. It can happen quickly with the help of the regulator. Those short-term needs include health and safety funding requirements, as well as the 5.6 billion needed to repair about 1,000 damaged schools, which happened during the lockdown, unfortunately. And building on that idea, as we move into the long term, I think that there's an opportunity for bonds or debt, as I've mentioned, to it. One of the elements around the recommendation, the fourth or actually fifth recommendation, is to ensure that any rollout that happens around ICT, because obviously there's been a lot of talk about ICT, should happen with a close eye on learning outcomes. I think we've fallen into the trap of rolling out hardware and software without using a systemic approach, and B, making those systems kind of performance-based. And I think that we can use innovative finance instruments to be able to ensure that happens. Then in terms of the last 4 recommendations, they very much have to do with enhancing quality. So using existing funding pools and non-traditional funding pools in a way that improves the effectiveness of delivery. And that includes funding NGOs and social enterprises as incubators for the public sector system. So that is one of the recommendations under that banner. The second is to capitalize on momentum in the market. There is already momentum around certain early foundation phase literacy and numeracy programs. For example, there's an opportunity to raise up to $50 million through the Global Education Outcomes Fund to support these kinds of programs. I also want to mention the TICSA, which is the Teacher Internship Collaboration that Jet is heading up. In partnership with DHET, the higher education institutions, and DBE to address the quality of initial teacher education in distance learning universities. And then finally, I think that there's a worthwhile investigation that can happen into accelerated skills development programs. I think the Bonds for Jobs initiative has received significant government support. They've proven a model. I think that model can be applied to other skills areas. So yeah, I think those are the recommendations. I would encourage people to read the report, to get informed, to get proactive. I don't think you have to change the whole system at once, but approach it with a system mindset. And I think our factor is really to serve underserved kids who deserve a great education.
Thank you very much, Dr. Susan, for sharing with us those critical insights and recommendations, strategies, as well. I really appreciate that. So this then brings almost us to end of our conversation. We thank you very much for making this time to share your expertise and us. And we also thank the viewers who managed to tune in. We are live on YouTube. In case you've missed half of this video, you can go back and watch the full video there. And the report is also available at Chat Education Services website. You can visit it and you'll find the full report there that Dr. Susan was referring to. And it's also available as well on other social media platforms like YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So before I finally close this conversation, Dr. Susan, any final words perhaps you'd like to share with the viewers or your research team or any other of the people that are watching?
I think I want to thank the JET team, highly professional, organized, very interesting, and specifically James. I think James is a visionary. I think that he's hit the nail on the project. It was great to be able to work with my co-researcher Tatenda. We had 5 or 6 junior researchers who were given the opportunity to contribute to the different pieces of research, and I think quite enjoyed learning a little bit about this area, which is new, and so it was new for them. And then our peer researchers, Natalie Vereen, who has been working in National Treasury, and Louise Saville from Social Finance in the UK, who have quite deep expertise in both public sector finance and innovative financing models, respectively. I don't think the report would look the way it does without their material inputs. So yes, thank you very much for the opportunity, and hopefully we can action some of this in the year and years to come.
Dr. Susan de Witt, thank you very much for having you again.
Great, thanks guys.
Thank you.